Hello and welcome to another visit to Iain Tyrrell Classic Cars Workshop, otherwise known on the channel now as Tyrrell's Classic Workshop. And this is part one of the promised series on the Lamborghini Miura engine rebuild. We're very fortunate to have lots of Miuras here at the moment, but we've never actually done a full sort of beginning to end coverage of a Miura engine rebuild, and what better car to pick than this one. Brought this car in for an engine rebuild to be done. It was burning a bit of oil and producing blue smoke. So we've done the initial strip down of the engine, and I'm going to be having a look at some of the components, the sort of wear and tear or not, as the case may be. Obviously there's something not right because it is burning oil. So we're going to be having a look into that and just see what the next course of action is following on from that. So let's take a look. Well, just to recap very briefly on the basic architecture of this engine, if it can be described as basic, which it most definitely is not. The engine was absolutely state-of-the-art in the 1960s. It was this particular engine, the layout was designed by Giotto Bizzarini as a race engine, and then Ferruccio Lamborghini bought the design from Giotto Bizzarini, provided he provided an extra amount of, a particular amount of horsepower, and that engine was 3.5 litre. Fast forward to the introduction of the Miura, and this was an out-of-hours project with three people, Bob Wallace, Gian Paolo Dallara and Paolo Stanzani at the Lamborghini factory. And I've had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Dallara, Gian Paolo Dallara, and you can see that in an earlier video, which I think is called Surprising a Legend. And that video is worth a watch because Mr. Dallara explains how he engineered this engine. He was the head of engineering at Lamborghini, how he designed this engine and the adaptation of it, the gearbox, etc. And it was very clever, very clever. In fact, the engine was 4 litre by the time this came along, and the Miura was an out-of-hours project that the three of them engaged in, hoping to persuade Ferruccio Lamborghini to go racing, which ultimately they failed to do because Ferruccio Lamborghini, as Clint Eastwood says, a man's got to know his limitations. And Ferruccio Lamborghini, for all his exuberant entrepreneurship, knew that if he went racing, it would just be a money pit. And Enzo Ferrari, he was not. So they had different strengths and weaknesses. So fast forward, they tried this as a sort of pushing the boundaries, vanity project, whatever you want to call it, outside working hours. And Gian Paolo Dallara took the basic 4 litre Lamborghini V12 that was used in the 400 GT, and he basically re-engineered it massively. The engine is actually almost identical to the 400 GT engine, which was then used after this in the Espada, Islero, even Countach when it came out in 1971, although that didn't hit production till 74. But it was all the same basic 4 litre engine, V12, all alloy. But what Mr. Dallara did, was to tack the gearbox. This is all one casting, as I've mentioned before. Engine, gearbox, and then differential. This is upside down, so it would normally sit the other way around in the car. Actually, it's all one casting, which is an incredible bit of engineering, really. But the V12 engine is a thing of beauty in itself. They are actually surprisingly reliable when they're maintained and looked after properly. Like all of these old engines with no electronic rev limiters and software for this and software for that, they are open to abuse, these engines. And unfortunately, a lot of the buying public, being able to afford one of these cars and being able to drive it in some way, shape or other, sometimes meant that people were only really skilled at destroying valuable machinery. But there is the odd exception where the car has been used and looked after properly, and this car, I'm happy to say, definitely falls into that category. There are many things that can go wrong with these engines. As I say, people can over-rev them from cold. They can do all sorts of things. Jane and Spike, in driving this car, have been highly mechanically sympathetic. This is no surprise to me, as I know them. But the fruit of this is that this engine actually is in good condition overall, very good. So I'm going to just look at one or two. We'll start with the crankshaft, actually. So yeah, we'll have a talk about that. Well, the crankshaft is a work of art by anybody's standards. This is what's called a billet crankshaft. So there are essentially three ways that a crankshaft can be made. Cast iron, which is the cheap and cheerful way. Forged, where it is stamped and compressed, the hot material in a mould to compress the molecular structure together. And billet, which is literally turned on a lathe. It's a solid bar, around about 140 millimeters outside diameter, weighs about 90 kilos before it started to be machined. And I don't know what the percentage of material loss is, 70, 80%, something like that is actually machined off this laboriously on a lathe. So it really is a thing of beauty. But what you end up with is something, I'm guessing the material, I've never had it analysed, but I think it's EN40B if you want to be really nerdy, which is an extremely strong steel alloy. And the design is absolutely state of the art. And there's a couple of things to notice on this in terms of sort of cleverness of design, and that is that these are the main bearings here. The crank pins, as they're called, the big end bearings, are actually overlapping the main bearings and vice versa. So there is no area where the crankshaft is actually, the big ends are out on a limb, as it were, from the crankshaft. Quite a few can be on various cars. It helps that this is a short stroke engine, so you don't have a sort of massive big end sort of radius, but it means extra strength for the crankshaft. That's what I'm driving at, pardon the pun. Yeah, it's sort of already, it's been born into a fortunate family in the fact that it's got all the right things going for it from the word go. And the discolouring here, the heat marks, is induction hardening. I mentioned this when we were rebuilding Harry's Espada engine. Professor Michael Faraday in 1831 invented induction hardening, which is an electromagnetic coil that actually surface hardens the metal. So, right, what I'm going to do now, we have our trusty Miura workshop manual here, which you've had for a few years. We do replace them every so often, or we've got various copies of it here. But I've got the specifications of the crankshaft. So, I mean, I can tell straight away that I'd be gobsmacked if there's anything wrong with this crankshaft, because looking at the shell bearings, etc., they're all just beautiful. Let's see what the diameter of this is. It is 43.7 millimeters. Wow. Well, the specification is 43.354 to 43.604, so this is slightly oversized, interestingly. This can happen. The running clearance on these crankshafts is normally, and people ask for this to be nerdy, so nerdy it is, you're looking at a running clearance of about 1.5 to 2/1000 of an inch on these crankshafts when they're normally, let's just pick a journal. I will go through them all, but life's too short to do this while the cameras are running. And that is 63 millimeters. And again, that's slightly larger at 62.729 to 62.979. So whoever's ground this crank has just left it a tiny bit oversized, but it's standard. It's not been reground to a smaller size. That's fine. I can cope with that. We're sort of in range, really, which is great. And again, that's a sign that the engine has not been starved of oil. It's had decent oil in it all of its life, because particularly on engines like this with big carburetors that literally just throw fuel into the engine. The fuel can actually, if there's any hint of a misfire or running rich, it can actually break down the oil and cause hydrocarbons to unburnt fuel, etc., to come into the oil. And that I had to rebuild a Ferrari in the 1990s, a very famous racing car, and the crankshaft was destroyed because the bearings had actually broken down with acid due to the hydrocarbons in the engine oil. And this had been run like that for years. It was criminal, really, but such is life. One of the reasons why I thought this crankshaft was going to be all right, and as I say, we will measure it all, but I can tell by the looks of it that just needs a basic polish. It's fine. Are these bearings, which are standard size again. Just get rid of the oil. Yeah, they're not yeah, 000, which means standard size, no 10 or 20 thou undersize or anything like that. And these are not Van der Velde. These would originally have been Van der Velde bearing shells. Doesn't matter. They're obviously the right ones that have been fitted last time the engine was rebuilt, which was quite a few miles ago by Miura standards. A Miura engine life expectancy can be as low as 25,000 miles, but this has lasted longer than that. But that's because, again, it's been sympathetically driven. But those bearing shells are in extremely good condition. They're just starting the tiniest bit of speckling there, which indicates that the shell is starting to just microscopically break up. So it would have gone on for many thousands of miles like that. But where are we? I did bring an example of a bearing shell. There we are. So this is a big end shell out of another car we got here, a Countach, and it's actually worn through this material on the outside of them. This is called a tri-metal bearing. It was Van der Velde who used to make these bearing shells pretty well exclusively. I think they did them actually with the Van Wall special. And it's a tri-metal bearing, so it's copper, aluminium, and then a soft facing, which is you can almost scratch with your fingernail. Considering the loads that the engine's put under, you can see I'm scratching it with my nail there. So fragile, and yet you've got all those tons of combustion pressure on that, simply because the layer of oil cushions it. Incredible, really, that it can be so soft. You can see the witness marks quite clearly where I've just scraped it with my fingernail. Do another one. There we go. So these would originally have been to VP2 tri-metal specification, which was the best you could get at the time, and tri-metal bearings. I don't rebuild modern car engines particularly, but I think they're still the ultimate. So let's have a look at the other parts now, the pistons. Well, moving right along, again another Clint Eastwood quote. I've watched far too much time watching his Dirty Harry films, but here we have a piston and connecting rod out of the Miura engine. Again, in lovely condition, absolutely beautiful this. The shell bearings are a model of what they should look like when they come apart. They're just very, in spite of, as I say, the bearing material being so soft, they're just hardly marked. This is the sign of an expertly maintained car. This is just wonderful. You don't often see cars like this with the best will in the world. They're not marked as such, but that looks like an original A.E. Borgo piston to me, or an exact copy thereof, probably from the 1980s, I would say. And again, we've been trying to chase the reason why this engine's been burning oil, and interestingly, again, just to digress for one moment, we have let's see, that is a compression piston ring which fits in the top two lands on the piston, and normally, not normally, but quite more often than not, these are broken. They're actually broken into pieces when we take these engines apart. And what happens is it's due to overfueling or revving too much from cold. There is a thin layer of oil on the outside of this piston ring in the cylinder called a boundary layer, which allows them to glide over each other. Otherwise, they would just last no time at all. And what happens is if you have too much fuel, for example, I had a Ferrari Daytona about 20 years ago, and the choke was stuck on. Would you believe? Somebody had the choke stuck on, and it actually broke down because it was pouring too much fuel into the cylinders. It actually broke down the top rings, and the result was disastrous. Bores worn, etc. You know, yeah, not good. But again, the pistons, there's no wear on there. This funny staining is us cleaning it. It's the cleaning solution we use, but there's just nothing there. Tiniest bit of rocking on the gudgeon pin, on the wrist pin, on the connecting rod there. I'm exaggerating it, but just the tiniest bit. So we'll need to rebush those and have a look at the pins. But otherwise, great. The other interesting thing to mention, if we are getting nerdy, these are aluminium pistons, aluminum, across the Atlantic, and they have this casting witness mark inside, this ridge inside going all the way round. That is called a pyro strut. And what it is, it's a steel ring that is actually, that the actual piston is cast around. It's inside the piston, or forged around. And what that does is the running clearance on these engines for the pistons is 0.1 of a millimetre or 0.04 of an inch. Tiny, tiny, tiny. So if it's bigger than that, and I've seen Lamborghini engines at sort of 0.08 of an inch, 0.2 of a millimetre, I mean, there's tiny dimensions. Even with that, the piston moves, it rocks in the bore. And you get what's called piston slap. I'm exaggerating, but it's actually the piston knocking in the bore, and it sounds like a diesel, particularly from cold. So the piston clearance is critical, and the pyro strut actually is a steel ring. It's there to strengthen the piston, but its main purpose in life is to stop the piston, the aluminium of the piston, expanding too much. Because aluminium has a higher coefficient of expansion than the cast iron liners that the actual cylinders that the pistons run in. So if you made the clearance correct or very small, as the engine warmed up, the piston would actually start to seize in its cylinder. So this pyro strut here is designed to absorb heat, but it's also designed to stop the piston expanding, almost bring its coefficient of expansion to the same as the cast iron cylinder liner it works in. Pyro struts were invented by an American in 1933, and they're, as I put it, one of those technological cul-de-sacs. They're sort of not used today, really. We have pistons made by CP Carrillo, which are forged, and you don't get any noise from them from cold, even though they will expand. Just technology moving on. But that's absolutely beautiful. There is, just put the ring in there to try. Yeah, there is no wear in the piston lands, negligible wear. So those pistons will actually have them tested. But those pistons and conrods look absolutely beautiful. Shell bearings, just the right amount of wear as I would expect. Very pleasing. So Jane and Spike, your conservative and careful driving has been rewarded big time. So what is it that's been causing this engine to burn oil? Well, we have here an oil scraper ring. So we've got the two compression rings on top of the piston, and then this oil control ring or scraper ring that goes underneath. And again, the land's in beautiful condition on that piston. There's no play there to speak of. The ring is actually an H section. It's got a garter spring that runs inside it. Like that. That actually sits inside the ring and keeps it pushed outwards against the bore. But the actual profile of the piston ring is H section. And what's happened is that the outer lugs on the H, the bits that scrape against the bore, are actually worn away. They've worn over time. It's crucial that this is the correct profile, obviously. If it does start to wear, you get too much oil blow-by, as it's called, and then it gets past the rings and up into the combustion chamber, and that's when the engine starts to burn oil. These are not the worst I've seen by any stretch of the imagination. They're bad enough to cause a problem, but I remember I had a customer with a Porsche 944 Turbo in the 90s, and he drove that car, once it was warmed up, he drove that car very hard. About 160,000 miles, I took the engine apart because it was burning oil, same scenario as this, and the ridges had completely disappeared off the oil control rings. There was no ridge left, and that was why his Porsche was burning oil. But yeah, very pleasing. This is a lovely engine to take apart. Really, it's an absolute privilege and pleasure to do it. I am just going to have a look at some others now. Well, one other area that there is actually wear, and this doesn't altogether surprise me, is the camshafts. These are going to, either we can have these reprofiled, or we're going to have to get a new set for it, which is not altogether a surprise. That one in particular has actually got a ridge on it. I can feel it with my finger. So these, of course, open the valves. Via the bucket, and that is also quite worn, quite damaged. The surface is beginning to break up. So the cam spins, opens the valve and closes it again. And these are worn, but that is, as I say, Miuras were not built to drive in traffic like modern traffic. Traffic jams, apart from the Italian job causing the traffic jam it did in Tyrrell in the film, idling is not something the Miura was built to sit and do for a long time. So it's not surprising that these cams have taken a bit of a battering, actually, because they've just been running too slowly, really. And that's not to say Jane and Spike don't drive the car properly when it's warm, because they do. But yeah, that's just one of those things. We can improve on that. Hopefully, we either, as I say, we have them reprofiled, or we get some new ones. Depends. And what else can I mention? Yeah, the other thing, we've measured the cylinder liners, the cylinder bores themselves, with a micrometer, and they are actually fine. So again, it's down to the piston rings and the pistons. We can give those some treatment. We've measured them for ovality. They're all within spec diameter-wise, as is everything else. I mean, incredible, really. They normally have a ridge at the top where the piston ring has been stopping going this far and no further. But it's just in really good shape, this engine. So we'll tickle up the bores, we'll do some honing and possibly some glaze busting, either or, depending on what we can do. Well, that concludes another Tyrrell's Classic Workshop video. Please remember to like and subscribe, it does help, and thanks for watching, and we'll be back with something else very soon.